I first heard of Tom as one of the good guys.
But the first time I ever met him in person was probably the same is true of all of you. It was an amazing experience. Tom was larger than life, couldn't begin to describe him.
I remember Richard Axel asking me skeptically, who is this Georgie Jessel, when Columbia was first interviewing Tom, and I told him that he was an amazing neurobiologist and that Columbia should hire him on the spot.
We knew other people who were, comparable with them intellectually. Not many, maybe 2, at most 3. But then none who had the combination of intellect and administrative skills and generosity of thought that he had.
Tom was one of a triumvirate of Columbia neuroscience giants, larger than life, but also understated, kind, and generous.
Tom is the one that shaped my scientific thinking and enhanced my love to neuroscience.
To me, he was the neurobiologist extraordinaire.
Being a part of the Jessel Lab in the 10th floor was the most exciting time in my scientific career.
The few years I spent in Tom's lab were undoubtedly the most formative and important of my scientific career. I remember the intellectual buzz and the genuine excitement about the research. It permeated the whole of the 10th floor of the Hammer Building. And I think all of us who were there remember that and were infected by it.
He was like the brilliant older brother I could never measure up to. When, to escape his shadow, I finally switched to a field in which I could no longer rely on his guidance and advice, I felt rudderless.
So Tom would always find time to read my manuscripts. And when he'd read the manuscript, he'd call me down to his office. And he'd look at me and he would say, "This is good." And he had this way of adding gravitas to his statement by doing this thing with his chin, thing with his forehead, and going, "This is good." And at that point, my heart would leap up because Tom, the great one, had just said my manuscript was good. So I was feeling so happy. But of course, as you can imagine, the next word that came from his mouth was "but."
Yes, every word in the manuscript had to be considered, questioned, and reconsidered. There were endless rounds of writing, rewriting, editing, and refining.
Each document, I had to brace myself for searing comments like,
"Figures and text are in awful shape." My personal favorite, "This is not English."
"This is fine, but I think you can do better." And, "Why don't you see how reorganizing this will work?"
I knew we were close to submitting a paper once the drafts went from being simply dated to having the time as well as the date on them. But the end results made it all worthwhile, and the process of challenging oneself to do better and never taking the easy and lazy route is one of the things I've learned from Tom.
And Tom has been a man of Renaissance. So curious, mixing everything. Mixing neuroscience with architecture, life, and everything, art.
I met the neuroscientist and I discovered the artist. Tom, who loved art, used to design his personal greeting cards, and I had the privilege to receive some of them.
And I remember going to dinner with him, and I was struck by how late it was and how he was still planning to get back to Manhattan, finish off whatever paperwork or experimentation he had to do, and then he was planning to go visit a jazz club late at night. And I thought this was both a statement about Tom, his love of jazz, his indefatigable personality and energy.
And what I remember about Tom is that he was very insightful. We all say, well, he is an encyclopedia andante. And he really was able to recall papers with incredible ease.
And he would say, "That one there, I think you will find that is Waddington 1953. And this one here, that is probably going to be Harrison 1926. Although I could be wrong, it could be Harrison 1929.
It was true at the time, and it remained true throughout his career, that the sources of his knowledge and inspiration were mysterious. How did he know that?
All of you know Tom very well. You know that he was the best at everything he did. He was the best scientist, he was the best writer, he was the best speaker, and to say he gave good talks is an understatement. He gave scintillating talks.
he could present the most complicated circuit, the most complicated problem in neuroscience with simplicity and passion. He was definitely the best speaker I have ever met.
And when Tom talked, it was mesmerizing. He perfectly formed sentences would come out one after another into perfectly formed paragraphs. It was incredible. Few people have the oratorial skills that Tom possessed. I will always remember the sound of his voice.
Arguably, there's no aspect of modern science that is more enigmatic but more challenging and exciting than understanding how brain function works, the nature of cognitive processes. So what I would hope is that through a selected set of examples, one can convey some of that enthusiasm.
And to be honest, my first interactions with Tom were largely surrounding the fact that he scared the shit out of me.
Yeah, but you weren't in his lab. You
No, I
went
know, so
there
I
when he
wasn't.
would come along in the evening and just sit down beside the bench and sit there saying nothing while you were in the middle of doing mini preps or something else. And he would just sit there until you lost your nerve completely and you ended up telling him things. It's very clever.
I had that. All I had was Tom being
Yeah.
very kind, because Tom always took... The thing I remember about Tom was he always walked with incredibly long strides, so I had to run to keep up with him. But he was always very kind, because he used to sort of bend down like that so he could actually
That was only
hear
because he
me.
could hear, because he wanted to get the right ear into the down.
No, it wasn't. It was because he was very kind.
Mm-hmm.
That it took me a while to realize is that Tom was deaf in his right ear, and when we spoke, he would often look at you with a puzzled look and ask you to repeat it, which of course to a young postdoc always felt like I had said something egregiously stupid. And I'd mumble and I'd walk away, and eventually I learned to talk into his left ear.
But Tom wasn't
No,
perfect.
Tom wasn't perfect, and he didn't actually like it when things didn't go right.
Tom, of course, could be famously stern. Woe betide the hotel clerk who got a room booking wrong and saw the Iceman striding towards them.
We were trying to inject the B1 blastomere of Xenopus embryos, and I didn't know how to find sperm in a male frog, so I asked Tom for help, and he was sitting there dissecting, and he was getting redder and redder and redder in the face, and suddenly Tom Novelli came up to him and said, "Tom, that's a female." Tom wasn't very happy.
I love chatting science with him, but also playing darts, playing foosball.
We both loved cricket, for example, and we used to go and watch cricket at Lord's together, and we had a lot of fun doing that.
Sorry, Tom, New Zealand beat England in the last Test match series.
One of my great memories about Tom was that he used to hang out with the girls. He used to hang out with the kids and always have some kind of interesting thing for them to do. He'd come up with some kind of scientific experiment or some kind of game that he would design. And they loved it, and he loved hanging out with them.
It was in Devon that he taught me how to hold a cricket bat.
In Dordogne that he explained how to properly package twigs to break the fall of an egg.
And taught me how to fly my new birthday kite.
And we went to a restaurant, and he told me to go around looking at all the serial numbers on everyone's euros, and said that to tell them that if there was a 7 on it, then it was fake money, and I needed to take it from them. I ended up the day with 80 euros, but unfortunately, my parents made me give it back.
When I was in college and just getting my bearings, Tom came up for a speech and invited me and 2 of my friends out to dinner. I was still getting used to being away from home, and I was so excited to see someone who felt like family to me. Afterward, I emailed him to say how nice it was to have dinner with a grown-up for the first time in a while, and he wrote me back, "Beck, are you calling me a grown-up?"
I, much to Les's annoyance, asked Tom, "Are you lucky?" I now know we and our family and colleagues are the lucky ones to have met and known Tom Jessup.
Tom was an incredible mentor to me during the time I was in the lab and long after I left and started my own lab. It was a privilege and honor to have trained with Tom. I miss you greatly, Tom, and thank you for everything.
On our faculty, he was without peer. There was really no one like him. And when we lost him, it was a tremendous loss. And I miss him terribly. I think of him often.
As I've started my own lab, I find his voice echoing in my mind all the time, challenging me to think deeply about how best to tackle the problems that we're studying.
Tom was my champion and always had my back.
As Tom never ceased to tell me later on that he'd done all the hard work with breaking in the parents and all I had to do was come along in his slipstream. So thanks, Tom.
He was as generous with his time and his knowledge as he was with his jumpers. When I last saw him, very cold and hungover, he lent me one and I'm not sure I ever gave it back. Sorry, Tom.
Like many, I miss Tom, but his influence and memory are still here.
Yeah, he left a trace of his hands and his mind on that building. In every ton of the steel of that building, in every detail, every floor, every material, it's still there.
To this day, memories of Tom I intertwine with those warm summer nights from our childhood.
Where in our mind, he's always there, sitting on the side with a glass of wine, looking over us.
Often teaching, but always caring.
He was intensely smart, intensely funny, intensely witty, intensely cheeky. I never really quite understood why he had as much time as he did for an equally cheeky Kiwi lad, but I'll be forever grateful that he did.
Here's to Tom.
Thank you for making us laugh, Tom.
Tom was clearly the smartest of a cohort of extraordinary talented people. He had a dry sense of humor, but he was also serious, but a lot of fun, and I'll miss him terribly.
I will most remember Tom as a friend, a patient tutor of cricket and motor control, a very demanding colleague, and a playful parent.
Yeah. See? You think you'd be going to class on Monday night? Sorry.
You fucking movie! You bastard!